Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian with the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm excited to be your host. What is your perception of creatine? Do you feel that creatine is dangerous and shouldn't be used by athletes? This is an ingredient I've personally heard mixed facts and false information about in my 20 years of working with athletes and clients. Whether it's a parent, doctor, coach, or athlete, I've heard creatine can damage the kidneys, cause dehydration, increases our risk for muscle cramps, and many other false claims. From the bro science world, we've heard what their opinion has been on the best source of creatine, and there's 7 or 8 different types. What does the science say about creatine use for athletes in regards to the best type, dosage, and the time to take? Does creatine have clinical application for things like concussion, muscle weakness, and other diseases? And is creatine safe for kids and adolescent athletes? In this episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Richard Kreider, who's been studying creatine for over 25 years. He serves as professor and executive director of the Human Clinical Research Facility and director of the Exercise and Sports Nutrition Lab at Texas A&M University. He's conducted numerous studies in nutrition and exercise, as well as published 6 books, 215 peer-reviewed articles, and book chapters, and over 457 research abstracts in 150 health and fitness-related articles. Dr. Kreider is a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine, an active member of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, co-founder, board member, and fellow of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, founding editor-in-chief of the Biomed Central Journal of International Society of Sports Nutrition, fellow of the American College of Nutrition, former board member of the American Kinesiology Association, elected fellow of the National Academy of Kinesiology, and member of the American Public Health Association, as well as a member of the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Kreider has been featured speaker at numerous conferences internationally and serves as a scientific expert consultant for industry and national professional organizations. Dr. Kreider, welcome to the All Me podcast. It's a pleasure having you here.
Happy to be here.
This is a great topic on creatine. I know this is a question in the work we do. We speak at a lot of different conferences and a lot of different schools and high schools, and whether it's physicians, parents, coaches, they're always asking about this. So I know the information you're going to present today and provide is going to be of extreme value to our listeners. So excited to really talk to you. And it's been a while since we've crossed paths at one of the conferences years and years ago. Before we get started and dive into creatine, what I want to first kind of talk about is really have our listeners learn about your career path, what interested you in the field of academics and research, especially focusing on sports nutrition and really diving into creatine. What led to that?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You know, I started out as a high school football player and ambitions to get to college, and I played football at Liberty University. And through that time, I was always on the small side. So I always had to really work on lifting weights and keeping my weight up and, to be able to compete with a little bit larger person. And this is back in the day when offensive linemen, they like short, stout guys that can get up and under the big, tall guys that we played against oftentimes, kind of like a Pittsburgh Steelers type lineman, about 6'1", 6'2" type person. And so strength was a big factor. So I was interested in strength and lifting and nutrition through high school. When I got to college, that extended, and I started going to college to become a strength coach. I wanted to be someone to work with teams and play in football and help train athletes. And back then, there were a couple of people who influenced me. One was at the University of Nebraska's strength coach, and I saw on ABC News Wide World Sports talking about how strength conditioning is up and coming and how teams are doing it. And then Bob Ward at the Dallas Cowboys was a strength coach for many years. And so I went to college with the ambition to be a football coach and strength coach. And I got through undergraduate school. And as I was finishing up, I'm thinking I'm going to go right and start and do strength conditioning. And they said, you really need a master's degree for that. I was a first generation college student. So I didn't know anything about what more than a bachelor's degree was. I thought you got one degree, you're good to go. And so they said, no, you really need to have a master's degree, especially if you want to coach at the college level, which was one of my ambitions. And so looked for a program and was very interested in exercise physiology and nutrition in undergrad. And so I went and got a degree in exercise physiology, and my goal was to be a strength coach. And after I got there, I got introduced to helping out with research studies, and my major professor mentioned, I said, you probably can have a bigger impact if you do research and then help people formulate what they could do to help more athletes. So they talked me into doing my PhD. And so I stayed on and got my PhD, and then I got fascinated in exercise and strength training and nutrition research, and had the opportunity to work with Mel Williams when I was a professor at Old Dominion. He's really who I call the father of sport nutrition. He wrote one of the first books in the 1970s. And we used it in my doctoral program. And so it was a great honor to work with him. And we did a bunch of studies at Old Dominion. And then that moved to Memphis. And then one of the reasons moving to Memphis was I wanted to work with resistance-trained athletes and football players in particular. And we had done a number of studies on ergogenic aids, things to improve performance through nutrition. And I got a call from one of the founders of EAS, one of the old companies that was the first to put creatine on the marketplace. They said, we have some studies out of England, and we want to do some studies in athletes here. And we've been following your work. Would you be interested in doing it? So we started doing research with EAS, the old phosphagen HP, phosphagain. We did all these studies looking at how creatine supplementation can affect training adaptations. And so we were the first group in the United States to do a study in trained athletes. And we used resistance-trained former football players primarily, the first study. And then we did studies in football players when I was at the University of Memphis for about 4 or 5 years, looking at safety and efficacy and what happens when you train. And we were the first university to use creatine. And the first other university called me was University of Nebraska, Dave Ellis. And he says, no, we heard you're doing this study. Is there anything to this? I've looked at some of the studies. So, well, Dave, here's what we got. I shared that with them, and they started having their athletes take creatine, and they won 2 national championships in a row. And the University of Memphis upset Peyton Manning and University of Tennessee, and all of a sudden all the Tennessee coaches are at our strength clinic the next December. So what did you guys do? And then they won the national championship then after that, and then all of a sudden everybody started using creatine as a dietary supplement. So we've been doing creatine research, among other things, since the early 1990s, and we're still doing studies on creatine in different forms and different ways to enhance uptake and try to promote adaptations, and now looking at the health benefits. So that's a long answer to your question, but I started out wanting to do strength conditioning, got interested in nutrition, then got interested in the research, and one thing fell in place, and we were able to do some of the seminal research on a number of different nutrients, and now our lab is recognized as one of the top in the world in doing sport nutrition and exercise nutrition related research. So I went from Memphis to Baylor as department chair, and then went to Texas A&M, where I'm at now, department head for 9 years, and now I'm the executive director of the Human Clinical Research Facility. And we do all types of research on exercise, nutrition, and health, both in athletes as well as people starting training programs, as well as people with medical conditions where nutrition and exercise may benefit. So a long answer to your question.
That's a great story. I mean, I love hearing stories and how things get started, especially when you're kind of the first and pioneer to do that. You mentioned Dr. Mel Williams. I love his book. I read that years ago when I was an undergrad as well. And you mentioned my friend Dave Ellis at Nebraska. He's kind of considered really a pioneer in our field of sports dietetics, of growing the industry of what we're doing now with sports dietitians. So great to see you guys have kind of been, and really the upset of Tennessee, that's just a cool story to say, like, what are you guys doing over there? And it's like, well, maybe Creatine gave us that benefit. So, you also mentioned you guys do other research. You're just not looking at creatine at Texas A&M. You guys have an incredible team of scientists and researchers on staff. And outside of creatine, just what are a couple of other areas or topics your lab currently investigates?
Well, we do all types of nutrition interventions with exercise or without exercise to improve health, performance, disease, or rehabilitation. So that's kind of the general focus of what we do. But over the years, we've studied HMB, CLA, different types of protein before and after exercise on training adaptations, all types of weight loss type of supplements to promote weight loss. We did a lot of the studies with Curves International, which was a big fitness facility and training program for women. So we did all their weight loss programs, and We've done work with other companies like Cellucor and doing other things with Natron and others that looking at more novel nutrients. So things like pre-workout supplements and supplements to try to improve health and reduce incidence of diabetes, all this type of things we've done over the years. So if you go to our website, exerciseandsportnutritionlab.com, you can see all the type of studies we've done over the years.
Yeah, we're definitely going to put that in the show notes for our listeners so you guys will have access to all the links. I'll get Dr. Kreider's information so you'll have that in the show notes. So let's really dive into this topic now of creatine. I don't think a lot of people understand where this stuff comes from. They think it's just a supplement. So let's talk about number one. What is creatine and how is it made?
Well, creatine is a base compound. It's an amino acid type compound that the body naturally produces. It's in every cell, every part of the body, and it's integral to the major energy system for high intensity exercise that lasts only short duration. This is the energy that allows you to sprint, do an explosive exercise movement, and it will last about 6 to 8 seconds before you start slowing down and other energy systems start kicking in. So almost all sports involve short, intense sprinting. So the interest in creatine initially was much like carbohydrate loading. Carbohydrate loading is where you add extra carbohydrate to your diet so that your muscle stores more carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. And doing that before a big event or competition gives you basically more gas in your gas tank to be able to last longer doing high intensity exercise that relies primarily on carbohydrate. Well, creatine is very similar. If you add extra creatine in your diet, even though the body produces it, about half the need of the day is produced naturally in the body. But the amount of creatine in your diet, which comes primarily from meat and fish, can influence how much creatine is stored in muscle primarily as this high energy bond called phosphocreatine. And so adding extra creatine to your diet is like carbohydrate loading, but for the anaerobic, the high intensity energy systems. And so what this allows you to do is sprint faster for a longer period of time, and in particular recover between high intensity sprints. So for example, in football, you do 4 or 5 second sprint for a play, all out effort, and then you jog back, you've got to recover. The body's trying to recover the energy used in that last play. And the more effective you are in recovering between sprints, the longer you last and you're able to perform, you won't fatigue as much. And this over time allows you to perform better, whether it's in the weight room doing more reps or recovering and doing more quality of reps the next set or so, more training adaptation. But the bottom line is it allows you to have more energy, and that gives you greater training intensity and volume, which leads to greater training adaptations. And so creatine was first thought to be an energy supplement, but we now know that creatine is involved in many other systems of the body and very integral to health. So maybe we can talk about that later as well.
Yeah, no, this is great response on that, and really kind of talking about that power athlete, but really the fact that it's composed of so many different things. And as you mentioned, it's into all of the cells utilize it. Now, I think a lot of people, when they think creatine, they just think supplement form. They don't think food. Are there any food sources that actually contain creatine?
Yeah, so if you have a pound of meat or so, you get about 1 to 2 grams of creatine. So, and things like salmon and fish are higher than others. So the challenge, though, is you have to have a pretty high meat or fish intake per day to get you in the loading or maintenance ranges that typically need to be taken in the diet. So supplementation is a more efficient way to get the creatine so that you don't have all the calories and all the other things that come with eating the meat that may not be good for maintaining weight or those type of things, or even for health if it's got too much cholesterol. So the supplementation form you typically take to load 5 grams or 1 teaspoon 4 times a day, every 4 or 5 hours. And then once you do that for a week, 5 days to a week, your muscles are full with creatine. It's called the loading period. And then once you've loaded creatine in the muscle, you only need about 1 teaspoon a day for an average sized person to maintain that full creatine gas tank. Larger athletes that we learned in doing our studies, like our offensive linemen, defensive linemen, and those type of athletes, typically need about 8 to 10 grams per day to maintain those creatine stores. So supplementation is probably more effective. It's very cheap. You can get a whole kilo now of creatine monohydrate for about $25 or $30. That lasts you 6 months of supplementation. If you tried to get that much meat to have that much creatine, you cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So it's a little bit more efficient to take the supplement.
Yeah, like you mentioned, eating 1 pound gives you, 1 gram, 1 pound would give you about 1 or 2 grams. Not many people are going to sit and eat 32 to 48 ounces of steak or fish in one sitting. That is going to be a really difficult task. Now, you mentioned supplemental.
Yeah, let me add something interesting. The history of sport nutrition. I did a paper just came out, talked about history of strength conditioning and nutrition, sport nutrition. And you look at back some of the recommendations in the Greek athletes, they had some athletes, they were told to have 10 kilos of meat before competition. That's creatine loading, you know. When I was playing football, we didn't have creatine, so what'd you do? You ate a lot of extra protein. I was eating 2 steaks a day and drinking 10 glasses of milk a day to try to keep my weight up.
Oh, wow.
Well, lo and behold, that was probably a creatine loading technique, the protein and all those things, plus the calories helped me keep my weight up. But so historically, we actually had people do that. You look at the diets in Eskimos, they have diets recorded of the native Eskimos of 3 or 4 kilos of fish per day. And so there are some populations that have done this, not knowing that was what they were getting from having that creatine.
Yeah. Outside of the powdered form and supplements, any other ways creatine is commonly delivered today or consumed by athletes or individuals?
Yeah, I think powder is the most effective and cost effective. However, we've actually studied creatine in lots of different forms. They had some energy bars that we put creatine in. There were even little kind of fruit chews that had creatine in them. One company developed kind of like a tart that had 1 gram of creatine in them, or chews like a fruit juicy type of chew. And then they are typically added into like protein powders. The old phosphogane was basically a carbohydrate protein powder with 8 grams of creatine. And so you can find creatine in lots of different forms. The ones to watch out for are the liquid form. The liquid form has really not been shown to be stable for any length of time. So until I see some data that definitively shows you can have a 5 gram or so dose in liquid that is sustainable with shelf life, we tell most people stay away from the liquid form of creatine.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I don't see a lot of the liquid anymore. I see mostly, obviously, the powder, some capsules, but I really see liquid. But I'm not in those supplement stores because they're kind of almost becoming obsolete with all the stuff with purchasing things online.
Yeah, now the only thing is Pepsi, and I think is it Bang or somebody, they have a form of creatine in their kind of energy drink now. Now, there's not much, but on the label it says creatine. So I think people know that creatine can help, and so why not have something, a little bit of creatine in it? The problem is I don't think there's a lot of that in there, and we're not sure about the stability. But there used to be old serum type thing where you did a little eyedropper and put it on your tongue, and it made claims about lots of creatine, and we actually did a study showed that wasn't quite the case. So just be careful. That's why creatine monohydrate pure from Germany seems to be the best form. It's called Creapure.
Yeah.
I don't like to drop names, but that's the one that the studies have consistently used to show to be effective.
Yeah, I know we have a question coming up on that I'm going to ask you about, and kind of why coming up soon, because that's going to be a big question on different forms.
Sure.
So yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you're kind of getting ahead, because we're going to really dive into that, because that's a big question we get, is all these different forms. Now, before we get there, the consumer, when they hear creatine, they automatically think athlete. They don't think any other population probably looks at this. And so I know this is an ingredient that's not just for athletes, but what are some of the applications of creatine supplementation for the non-sport athletic populations, or just people that don't play sports at all, or even in the clinical population? Because when you type in creatine in PubMed, there's over 59,000 references or studies. So this tells me there's so much more to research than what's found in athletes. What have you guys done out in that area?
Yeah, creatine is one supplement that started out in athletic population that has transcended into the health and medical populations quite significantly. It's probably the best case of a sports supplement that is now looked at as a health supplement. And why do I say that? In 2010, we have about every 5 years a creatine conference, which a lot of the researchers get together and they do special issue in amino acids or some journals. And in 2010, the conclusion of this conference was that everybody should have at least 3 grams of creatine per day from diet and or supplement availability just for the health benefits. And it's more important the older you get to help maintain muscle mass and cognitive function. And there's even certain diseases and things that creatine has been shown to reduce. So I'll give you some examples. We're all worried about concussion in sport, spinal cord injuries, okay? But there's also traumatic brain injury from the military, car accidents, etc. Creatine in animals, when you give creatine, it is neuroprotective. So studies that have taken animals and actually caused a spinal cord injury show that there's a less severity of the spinal cord injury when the animals are fed creatine versus a normal diet. They've also done the same thing with concussions, where if animals were creatine loaded and fed, they had less severity of concussions. They've done the same thing with ischemia and stroke models. And so you can't do those studies in humans, but the animal studies show that there's this neuroprotective and ischemia protective. It means whenever there's a lack of oxygen in the brain has to rely more on the energy systems that creatine's involved with. And so when the body and brain has more creatine, it withstands the injury better and the rehabilitation better. And so even in non-athletes, anybody susceptible to head injury or concussions or traumatic brain injuries like in the military, creatine is something that can help reduce that. So we're really interested in that type of thing. There's even studies showing that creatine can reduce blood lipids. A couple studies, one of ours and one from Dr. Conrad Ernst, showed that. We never expected it, but we found that. There are studies showing that creatine supplementation in patients with muscular dystrophies, Lou Gehrig's disease, and other neuromuscular diseases like Parkinson's and things like that may also benefit from creatine supplementation. Although some of the studies are mixed, there's enough body of evidence to suggest that there may be something there. There's studies in elderly. If you give elderly creatine and put them on a resistance training program in particular, they can build muscle, they have better stamina, endurance, they don't lose muscle as they age as much, and their cognitive function can improve. There's even studies in Australia in women, in animals first, who are pregnant, and they induce asphyxia or blue baby, where the cord gets wrapped around the neck and limits oxygen supply during the birthing. And the animals fed creatine have a much greater, less incidence of asphyxia and death related to the blue baby asphyxia because of the brain function. So now we're actually looking at studies down in Australia where women in the 3rd trimester, because the child as it's developing is using creatine from the mother, there's a greater dietary need of creatine for the females. So supplementing with creatine during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy is being looked at as a way to reduce neurological problems in kids. And a lot of the initial studies on creatine on large doses over time, long-term studies, were done in kids who have deficiency of creatine and phosphocreatine in the brain, which is accompanied with slow progression and mental function and things like that. So there's this whole body of health-related impact of creatine. And so in our last position stand from the International Society of Sport Nutrition, we not only summarize the exercise-related data and what we know, but there's a whole section on the medical applications of creatine that are now being studied and in many instances having some promising results. That creatine's gone beyond the sports supplement and now is really a health supplement. And it seems to be the older you are, the more important it is to get creatine.
Yeah, I mean, what you basically just kind of identified is the versatility that creatine provides. It's not just no longer that athlete supplement. It's really something we should all be taking. I have a good friend of mine in the personal training world. He speaks at a lot of different conferences as well. And you'd look at him and you would never think he's in his late 60s. He looks like he's either in his really early 40s, late 40s, early 50s. But he's like, look, I've been taking 3 or 4 grams of creatine a day for the last couple of years. And he goes, it's really made a big difference for him just maintaining his strength and, as you mentioned, neurological function. So I think those are incredible things that we're going to shift and let people understand. As we shift into the athletic world now, I know you've talked about the benefits of using creatine in athletic populations for more of that power athlete, the football player, the track and field sprinter. Are there any other athletes that are, maybe the endurance athlete? Would you see any benefits in that?
Yes, absolutely. So initially we thought creatine was mainly for the power athlete, the guys throwing iron around in the gym and things like that. But now we know that creatine has lots of applications for other types of athletes. Now, what do I mean? Endurance athletes are dependent on carbohydrate, right? Glycogen and carbohydrate. That's why they're low, to have more gas in the tank. There are studies showing, actually one out of LSU, that shows that if you creatine load athletes or they carbohydrate load before a big competition, the carbohydrate stores are increased as well as the creatine stores. So having athletes, endurance athletes that are creatinous of the carbohydrate load, and that means I'll even have a bigger gas tank than I could have had if I was just doing carbohydrate load. Endurance athletes also have challenges in thermoregulation. I think we're going to talk about cramping and dehydration a little bit later, but there are studies on creatine that show that if you have creatine-loaded muscle, you're able to withstand the temperature and the heat and tolerate exercise and heat to a better degree. So that may help the endurance athlete be able to perform in a hotter and more humid environment without as much propensity for cramping, especially if they add glycerol to the creatine supplement. A lot of studies have been done in things like soccer, which is endurance-based because you're doing a lot of running and jogging. You run 10K during a soccer match on the average, but it's sprinting and recover. And so the creatine not only helps you with sprinting, it also helps to recover a little bit. And so there's been studies showing more work capability and better sprinting capability at the end of a soccer match type of a simulated study compared to not. And the other thing that creatine can do for these type of athletes is a lot of athletes lose muscle mass during the season. And so we try to have them extra protein and do resistance training to keep their muscle mass up. But creatine athletes seem to not lose as much muscle mass over the season as those who haven't taken creatine. So there's lots of applications in sport other than just the football player and the weightlifter. We're now seeing it really applies to all types of athletes that has some type of endurance base in which glycogen can be an advantage, or an intermittent type of rest and recovery period during competition, basketball, soccer, whatever it might be. So creatine seems to be a benefit to lots and lots of sports now, much more than we used to think.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize, no matter their sport, there's going to be a power component. Even if you're a cross-country runner, towards the end of that race when you're sprinting to the finish line, those creatine stores are going to be activated, and that's an important thing. And I'm glad you mentioned the LSU study because that's my alma mater. Both my undergrad and grad was there, and I'm assuming that's Dr. Arnold Nelson, maybe his team or some scientists there.
Yeah, it's Dr. Nelson, and he actually also did an interesting study on also something that can affect endurance athletes. He showed that it could increase anaerobic threshold. The anaerobic threshold is the highest oxidative level you can maintain before you start building a lot of acidity and lactate starts to accumulate in the blood and those things. So it's usually the highest race pace. It's like your pace that you can maintain and not get fatigued at. And they actually showed that it can increase anaerobic threshold as well. And we now know that creatine is involved in shuttling of ATP in and out of the mitochondria. So there's a lot of physiological biochemical processes that creatine has a role in that can also help the endurance athlete be able to maintain a faster pace.
Yeah.
And that was another study also did.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting and a lot of great information there. Now, is there a population that would benefit from using creatine over others? Let's say a vegetarian, a vegan, someone that doesn't eat meat and doesn't get creatine.
Yeah, great question. All right, so I mentioned that you get about half of your creatine that your body needs from your diet. And to give you a further illustration about this, the normal person has a gas tank that's only about 2/3 full of creatine. if they maintain a normal diet that includes meat and fish. Vegetarians, however, who don't have as much meat and fish in their diet, obviously, have even lower levels of creatine. So their gas tank may be only half full of creatine. So there are studies showing that creatine is more effective in vegetarian type individuals because they start at a lower starting point. And then by taking creatine with things like carbohydrate or protein, because creatine uptake is influenced by insulin and glucose uptake, you can get that gas tank up to full simply by adding a little bit of creatine to your diet and ingesting with a little bit of carbohydrate.
Cool. No, that's interesting to know, and something for me to keep in mind when working with those vegetarians or vegan athletes that have those questions, especially in those power-based sports. Now, I want to shift to my really favorite part of this, really the supplement world, and getting into the different types of different forms of creatine. I've seen 7 or 8 different forms. It's kind of funny because when I'm presenting slides at conferences, I show the audience ways that supplement companies are scamming people, really not even providing and being transparent with the dosage, and just putting a bunch of different types of creatine in that product. Now, how many types of creatine are actually circulating on the market that's being used in products that you see?
Dozens, all types of forms. In fact, we did a paper in 2011 looking at all the different forms of creatine and determining whether there's really any evidence that they work or are more effective. So there's all different forms, and unfortunately in the supplement world, companies often try to market things and enhance the known information about it a little bit more, called puffery. And one of the unfortunate things is they'll say, oh, ours is safer, or ours causes less cramping, ours does this because we're using this particular form. And so the forms have changed. And we've actually done a lot of those studies to start out with creatine monohydrate, and then we did things like creatine ethyl ester and creatine serum and crealkaline, which is kind of a buffered form of creatine. And just all types of things are out there. And you actually look at the amount of creatine delivered, because if it's combined with something, it's not 100% creatine. It's combined with something, maybe it's only 60% or 80% creatine. So the total amount of creatine is the most important thing. And as long as you get about the same amount of creatine, you're going to get generally about the same effect. But what happens is they'll say, oh, you don't need to load on ours. Ours is 10 times greater, more absorption, and da-da-da. And then you look at there's really no data to support that. And when you do a comparative study, you get some effects, but not as much as if you just gave the regular 100% creatine monohydrate, which is almost all creatine. So there are lots of forms out there, and buyers have to beware. And we tell folks to stick with what we know works, and which is less expensive, and that is good quality creatine monohydrate.
And that's kind of led to my next question. It was really out of all the forms, which one would you consider being the gold standard? Is that still creatine monohydrate?
Yeah, I would say so. We like I mentioned, we did studies on lots of these. One I didn't mention was creatine nitrate. Creatine works. Nitrates are pretty effective in vasodilating. Combine them, maybe get a greater effect. The bottom line is you have to get the creatine in. And as long as the different form provides similar amounts of actual creatine, they'll do about the same. And the problem is, gram by gram, creatine monohydrate is still the best, and it's much less expensive. So I said that a kilo of creatine monohydrate, good quality, may be $25 a kilo. That's 2.5 cents a gram. So it takes 10 cents, 15 cents a serving. You can't get much better or much cheaper than that. And all these other forms of creatinines and the creatine nitrates and the serum and all these things are much more expensive than just regular creatine monohydrate. So we tell folks to get good quality creatine monohydrate. There's a lot of cheap forms out there, especially from China, that have been found to have some more impurities in them. So we usually tell folks to stick with the best source that we know of creatine, which is from Germany. It's called Creapure. And you can actually look on labels. A lot of supplement companies will put that label on there so you know it's a quality creatine. And so that still seems to be the best, although, we're always looking to see if we can combine creatine with other things to see if there's a greater synergistic effect. But it still seems that creatine monohydrate is the tried, true, and best and most cost-effective way to increase creatine levels.
I've seen some marketing around creatine hydrochloride or creatine, also known as creatine HCl. And I haven't seen much research, but anything that you found based on the claims they make, because they're claiming this stuff's the gold standard of it. What is your opinion on this, or based on your knowledge?
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about this, and I actually get involved in some of these lawsuits when they're making these claims. And I always tell my students when we talk about sport nutrition is, hey, listen, there are things that can work, but there's also a lot of stuff out there that there's a lot of puffery about. Things are just kind of overblown. Always show me the data. Ask the question, show me the data. And you want to see some good quality, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies from a reputable research group, hopefully 3 or 4 to show that there's a similar effect. And when you look at these new forms, they're marketed and they claim to be much more absorbed and better, and all these claims like, well, if you put it in water, it mixes better, so therefore it's going to absorb better. Creatine monohydrate's 99% absorbed in the body, so it's hard to improve above 99%. And so ask the question, show me the data, look for the science. If there's good quality published studies and there's several that show the same thing, you might say, well, maybe it's worth a try. Look for the ISSN, the International Society of Sport Nutrition. Look at our position stands to give you guidance about what to try, what to not to try, because we've synthesized the literature, looked at it carefully, and have a consensus of agreement among a lot of the scientists and sport nutrition colleagues that we have that this is sound scientific advice. So that's what I would always tell parents and tell kids and people interested in taking creatine is follow the science, show the data, and when these new forms come out, the first question should be, all right, where's your data to show that this is more effective than creatine monohydrate? In almost all cases, they have none. And then occasionally we'll do the study, and it'll come out a year or 2 after it's been marketed, and guess what? It shows it wasn't as effective as creatine monohydrate. May have worked a little bit, but not nearly as good as creatine monohydrate.
You know what's funny, Doc, in this world that we work in, it seems like pseudoscience gets so much more appreciation and attention than actually scientific evidence that shows multiple studies. They think there's a magic pill. It's amazing.
Well, everybody's chasing after the next creatine or a better form of creatine, or another supplement can do something like that. And so, there's always interest in trying something beyond. And that's one of the things about training and performance, and because everybody's going to try to get an edge some way. And the bottom line is you need to make your decisions based on what we know is good quality science. And sometimes it takes a little long for us to come out with the results, but we finally do. And when we do, it may be worth trying something that makes sense, that there's a little bit of data support, but be careful where you get your information. And if you're getting it from the advertisements themselves or the companies themselves, you better look to make sure that there's some research to support it. If there's studies that they're citing, and you look at those studies and they make sense and they show, hey, this works, then it may be worth something to try. If there's a few studies, maybe it's worth trying. If there's a bunch of studies, you can have good confidence it probably does. If they don't have any research to support it and it's all theory, you might want to stay away from that for a while.
Interesting. And that kind of leads to really the next question when it comes to parents. You mentioned parents or young athletes or coaches. The question on dosage, just in general, you mentioned a little bit about loading and maybe maintenance phase, but when it comes to, let's say, optimal strength, body mass, should we load or should we use a maintenance dose? What has your research found?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people think, well, you don't need to bother the loading, you'll eventually get them there. If you're interested in performance and training adaptations, or more immediate effects of creatine, you still need to load. And there's no reason not to. We actually, our first few studies, we gave up to 25 grams a day of creatine for, the entire spring football season in athletes and found no problems with it. And so there's really no reason not to take higher doses, especially if it's only a week. And so for athletes and people that we want to get the immediate effects, we always tell them to load. Now, for somebody that's older, that's really not worried about getting stronger, performing better, you just want some health benefit, 3 grams, a half a teaspoon or so a day is plenty for the health benefits. But if you're interested in performance, load and then maintain with that, 5 to 8 grams or so a day, depending on your body mass. What about kids? I get that all the time. And everybody's like, well, we shouldn't be recommending any supplements to kids. Well, if we're really interested in performance, what's the main supplement we recommend for athletes? Water. Are we going to tell kids not to take water? Well, water is water. But you'd be surprised. There are some high schools in some states that will restrict providing sports drinks to athletes because they don't want it to be spilled on the floor or something. Okay. A lot of studies were done initially in kids with creatine with neuromuscular diseases, and they've done studies for years giving them 2 to 3 times the recommended doses that we typically tell an athlete to take, and have had no adverse effects from that long-term intervention. In fact, they're more dependent on large amounts of creatine. And so we always have recommended that, and we mentioned this in our position stand, is creatine is no different than carbohydrate in our minds. We wouldn't tell young athletes not to have a high carbohydrate diet because they need to perform and need the extra glycogen. And so if they're training properly, that means they're involved in intense training, and they're eating a good and well-timed performance-related diet, meaning more carbs and quality sources of protein and lower on fat, and doing meal timing to try to do things before and after workouts to try to optimize. If you're doing all that and you're at a competitive stage of an athlete, then they certainly should consider things like carbohydrate loading and creatine loading and things that we know the science shows is safe and effective. Why I also say that, there are a lot of elite athletes, swimmers, gymnasts, other types of athletes, that they peak when they're 14, 15, 16 years old or in the Olympics at those levels. And we've actually worked with some of those years. And in our mind, there's no reason not to allow a younger athlete, as long as they and their parents know what creatine can do, and it's monitored, and they take a quality supplement, it should be just part of the normal training program. Does that mean we use creatine in substitute of training? No. Or a good diet? No. But if you're an elite athlete trying to prepare, and a high school kid trying to junior year and senior year trying to get into college, and and got scouts looking at you in basketball, football, or soccer, whatever it is, you need to be able to perform and train and help your body mature. And this is one way that can do that in a natural way, and also keep kids away from taking things dangerously like anabolic steroids and those type of things.
Absolutely. I mean, you kind of had me shift one of my questions that I was going to ask, one of the last questions, but I'm going to move it up since we're talking about youth. Is there a certain age that someone could start taking creatine? Because we get a lot of questions about creatine safety in young athletes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies that say this stuff's safe, but where would you start?
I would think generally it's after puberty is generally where we would think about doing things other than that. Let kids be kids for a while, eat good quality diet. But if they're involved in serious training and competition in some sports that may be younger than others, and they're past puberty and they're lifting weights and they're doing things to prepare themselves, adding a little creatine to the diet is only going to give them a little bit more energy and will help them recover. And if they're involved in sports that can cause brain injury or concussions, even high school football players, those type of things, certainly we would think that this would be something wise for them to take.
Yeah, great review. I think that's a big part of this. And I'm going to save my favorite question to last. We're almost there. Kind of getting back to the timing of this real quick is, some research has suggested some benefits of using creatine post-workout instead of pre. Any thoughts on this as really the best time to take it for optimal performance, or let's say increasing our creatine stores?
Sure. The best way to maximize creatine uptake is to take creatine with carbohydrate and or carbohydrate and protein. The best time to store muscle glycogen and consume carbohydrates after exercise. Now, there have been some studies look at pre-creatine acutely, post-creatine, have creatine with your protein drink before you work out or after. And most of the studies really show as long as you can increase your creatine in your muscle, the timing is really not a factor. So it comes down to convenience. So what we have usually done over the years is right after exercise is really important time to get nutrients. We usually have a pre-workout snack that we talked about in our book, small amount of carbohydrate, a little bit of protein, 5 to 10 grams of protein or essential amino acids with about 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrate, 30, 60 minutes before exercise. And then after exercise, you want to have about a half a gram of protein per kg and about a gram or so of carbohydrate per kg. after the workout to be able to accelerate resynthesis of glycogen, muscle repair, stimulate protein synthesis. We think that's the best time to add your creatine to your supplement. And so we always are focused on post-workout creatine and carbohydrate protein supplementation as just a convenient way. Whether that's better than having it just in the morning with a drink or something, the studies don't show that. We just think it's about convenience and timing. And if you're going to get the effect and create the health with glycogen storage and those things, post-workout seems to be a good time to do it.
Good. Yeah, I've been recommending it to my athletes post-workout, as you mentioned, with carbs, with protein, to really get that recovery process moving. Now, as we close out, I want to really focus on the safety. That's always been a big question because you hear so much misinformation on safety of creatine. What has the research demonstrated on the safety of creatine, especially when looking at markers of kidney and liver function? Have there been long-term studies to look at this?
Yes, and so this is fascinating. There's a lot of folks who just don't like supplementation, and a lot of folks in our field, especially nutrition, even exercise science, is like, oh, all you need to do is have a good diet, and none of that stuff, protein, none of that stuff works. So historically, that's how we've been trained for, when I went through, you didn't need to do anything, just eat a normal diet and work out, and you're going to get the adaptations you need. We now know there's a lot more to training and nutrition than simply following a normal diet. So one aspect of this is, well, if there's something works, there's got to be something wrong with it. And so I remember after we started doing our studies, a lot of teams started using creatine. I remember in 1998, Bill Kramer, who's many people may know as one of the top resistance training sports scientists out there, and myself were interviewed and put in USA Today. Because there was a wrestler that supposedly died. He did die, but supposedly they were taking creatine, and my goodness, creatine could have killed them. And it was like a front page thing on USA Today that creatine causes death, right? And so that spawned a lot of interest. Is creatine safe? I mean, nobody ever shown any problem with creatine to that point, but the media goes crazy with, as we all know, with just a small amount of information. So we actually started doing studies on safety of creatine, and we did some studies for about 3 years on football players at the University of Memphis when I was there, looking at injury rates, and there are all type of things like, creatine causes cramping, creatine causes dehydration, creatine causes renal kidney problems, and anything that happened to an athlete, it had to be the creatine, right? And so we started doing safety studies, and we found the exact opposite. What I mean, the amount of cramping, heat-related injuries, muscle strains, pulls in athletes, renal problems, all the blood work was completely opposite of the anecdotal stuff we were seeing in all the type of news media and on the internet. In fact, the first article that's written about the potential anecdotal problems with creatine, I wrote. And I wrote it in sports science, and I did it to say, hey, there's a lot of people saying things are bad about creatine, but here's what we know. And unfortunately now everybody kind of claims, creatine causes problems. And heat problems, dehydration, cramping, everything that has been said about creatine as a negative is completely opposite. And so we make a point in the ISSN position stand to go through all the safety. And there's really not any supplement, maybe just other than carbohydrate, that has ever been as extensively studied as a safety standpoint, not only in athletes as well as in patient populations, and shown a better safety profile. All the evidence is that it reduces injuries, it reduces cramping, it reduces renal problems, it reduces all the potential side effects that have been reported. So here's an example that if you look at the internet and what sometimes is described in the popular literature, it doesn't always match the science. So the last 20 years, we've been trying just to say, folks, it seems to be safe. This is what the research is. And a lot of physicians are finally getting to the point where they say, maybe this is safe. And so we're now at the point where I think we're over it, but every once in a while a new company comes in and make a claim about their form of creatine being so much superior because it doesn't cause the cramping, it doesn't cause heat problems, it doesn't cause these side effects. And unfortunately, it's been perpetuated by the industry. as a way to get advantage over the competitors rather than on science.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that when it comes to dehydration, creatine actually may be a benefit because there's a lot of parents and physicians mentioning that creatine can cause dehydration. Is this true? Should someone increase their water intake when they take creatine, or will creatine actually?
Yeah, great question. That's one of the myths about creatine. There's actually studies showing that if you give creatine and have athletes exercise in the heat and under the same conditions of fluid intake, that creatine reduces the thermal load on the body. It makes it easier to exercise in the heat, that you don't get cramping, you don't get dehydration. And there's even studies where if they've combined creatine with glycerol, another compound that helps the body actually retain fluid. And so an endurance athlete may want to have that if they got to prepare in a really hot environment, or a football player or something has to play in a very hot environment. You can actually kind of load with water a little bit to allow for more fluid. Well, when you add creatine to it, it even has a better effect. So that's an example of the myth saying that it could cause a problem where the actual studies show, no, it's actually the opposite of that.
Excellent. Well, my last question, and this is kind of one that I'm really interested to see what your response is. What do you say to a young person who is looking to get bigger and stronger and wants to take creatine, but is burning more calories than they are consuming? So if they're in a big calorie deficit, I had this question a few years, last year, a dad called me, a kid I was working with, he's a quarterback, he's 6'3", he's 150 pounds, and he's training for 6 hours a day because he's got football, he's got basketball, and he needs 5,000 calories. But he's only consuming 3 because he's burning so much. And his dad's like, well, what about creatine? And I'm like, look, creatine might help from a recovery standpoint with all the muscle breakdown, but it's not going to help him gain weight because he's constantly in a large calorie deficit. Is this true? Can creatine help them at all, or he needs to get those?
Yeah, I think creatine can help in that scenario by helping keep some of the muscle mass longer in a hypoenergetic state. But if you're trying to build muscle, it's really important to keep a positive energy state. In fact, a paper just came out showing that if you put people on a lower calorie diet and you do resistance training, that you don't get the same stimulus of the resistance training when you're on a high or low calorie diet. And so I think that's one of the reasons why generally to build muscle, you need to be in a positive energy state. Now, adding creatine can dramatically increase that. Our studies show if you gained a kilo of muscle mass over a month and a half, you get about 2.5 kilos if you were taking creatine. With that said, one of the things we've been doing is do a lot of weight loss studies. And when people go on a lower calorie diet, we're worried about loss of muscle with the weight loss. And if you can maintain muscle and maintain resting energy metabolism, you might have a more permanent effect of the weight loss and be able to help prevent the regain over time. So we do resistance training. We've done higher protein diets. We think that if they added creatine with that, and maybe even HMB, which is the anti-catabolic amino acid, that may help people lose fat but preserve their muscle mass on a low energy diet. Now that's for dieting. And you would still not want to have an athlete in a negative energy state, because one of the first principles is you got to have enough calories to meet their energy demands. They got to have enough carbohydrate, protein to help them perform as well as recover. And so if you have an athlete that's low, that's the first thing to get to correct. Got to get them back to what they actually need so they can have a positive adaptation of training. And creatine certainly helped in that regard.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, Doc, this has been a phenomenal podcast, a lot of incredible information. But before we go, I have some curveball questions for you. Now,
okay.
Questions that are not related at all to what we're talking about today. And I love doing this because it really kind of throws people off. So there's no perfect answer or anything, but it's just to kind of learn a little bit more about you and some things that people might not be aware of. So I'm gonna ask you 3 questions, if that's all right, and just to kind of get an idea of what kind of answers we're going to get. Now, this one's kind of funny. I've never asked this one yet. If you were a professional wrestler, what would be your entrance theme song?
Oh, wow. I used to be, when I was playing football, very interested in wrestling. We used to go down to the wrestling matches and stuff when they were in the town, and me and a bunch of other buddies would go and give them a hard time, on the front row and stuff. So yeah, I'm a big wrestler. So what would be a song? Probably something from Led Zeppelin, try to, one song, I can't remember the name of it, that kind of gets really psyched and ready to go, like something's going to happen good.
They have.
I can't remember the name of the song. Probably Led Zeppelin.
I'm trying to. Unique. That would be.
Yeah.
I can't think of the song for some. I used to sing in a rock band, and that we'd close out "Whole Lot of Love." There we go. There it is.
Yeah, that's it.
So you mentioned that you played sports, but what sport would you compete in if you were in the Olympics?
If I was in the Olympics, I probably would have done Olympic weightlifting, maybe. I was an old offensive lineman, a little bit too slow to be a perfect fullback size. Probably a touch slow for, NFL or something like that. But I would think probably weightlifting, or I would think curling, but, something I could do in the Winter Olympics. But probably that, or shot put discus. I did that through high school.
Excellent. Last question, and we'll let you go. You spent enough time with us and gave us a lot of great information. If you could choose any two famous people to have dinner with, who would they be?
Oh, wow. Well, probably Christ. Jesus Christ would be the first one, obviously, for me as a Christian. And then I would probably say, over time, Ronald Reagan. Man, what a leader he was. It would have been awesome to be able to meet him. I actually saw him in college speak one time, which was pretty phenomenal.
Excellent. Doc, incredible information. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us, provide a lot of valuable information our listeners are going to really benefit from. And always good to talk to you, and hope to see you once all this is over at a conference in the near future. And I want to attend this creatine conference one day. I'm always been fascinated with the research on creatine because of the versatility. So I'd love to attend one of those as well.
Very good.
Thank you so much, and I hope you and your family stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
You too. Take care.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.